Дорогие соотечественники,
Dear countrymen, fellow citizens,
в силу сложившейся ситуации
this formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States,
государств, я прекращаю свою деятельность,
I am obliged to resign as President of the USSR.
принимаю это решение.
This decision is based on principle.
Я твердо выступал
I firmly support the concepts of autonomy, independence for the people, and the sovereignty of the republics.
но одновременно и
But
за
I also
сохранение
defend the preservation of the Union, keeping the country as a whole. However,
события пошли
events have decided otherwise.
возобладало
The movement to divide the country and dissolve the state has prevailed,
чем я не
and this I cannot accept.
я покидаю
I leave my post with great concerns,
но и с надеждой
but also with hope and belief in you,
вас, вашу мудрость,
in your wisdom,
духа.
and in your willpower.
Всем вам самого доброго.
I wish you all the best.
For years, the USSR dominated the globe. Its military, political and economic grip on the world seemed unshakable. Then, with the stroke of a pen, it was gone. How did this great nation sow the seeds of its own destruction? At its height in the mid-20th century, the Soviet Union was a massive economic, industrial and military power, provoking admiration from some and terror from others. The nation stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Bering Strait. The Republic of Russia made up most of the territory, along with 14 other republics organized around an omnipotent central government. In this diverse country, people in distant republics had few cultural ties to the capital in Moscow. To the west were the countries of the Warsaw Pact, an alliance whose communist governments owed their very existence to the USSR. Soviet propaganda presented an image of a well-oiled machine. The Communist Party controlled the government. The leaders of the party were the leaders of the nation. Tight control over the media and civil liberties assured that nothing would ever challenge their authority. Those in power had become inflexible, and change was a foreign concept. But by 1985, even the most hardened bureaucrats could not ignore the facts. The centralized economy had stagnated. Superpower status had come at too high a price. Millions of rubles flowed into Eastern Europe to bolster communist allies. What was left drained into a costly arms race with the United States and into a disastrous war in Afghanistan. Behind the veil of rhetoric and pageantry was a nation in decline. In the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union appeared to be a dominant superpower, but behind the Iron Curtain, the nation struggled.
There was a very widespread feeling at that time in the leadership of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union that the country had somehow lost its way, that economic development was faltering, that the Soviet Union was falling further and further behind the West. Now, all this was brought to a head by the deaths in quick succession of three general secretaries of the Communist Party, Brezhnev, Andropov and Chernenko. Chernenko was desperately sick even when he was elected, and there was a strong feeling that this was diminishing the prestige of the Communist Party within the Soviet Union and of the Soviet Union in the world, and that something had to be done about this.
The Politburo, the government's top decision-making body, realized it could not afford another short-term leader. It needed to appoint a younger politician who would revive the economy whilst maintaining the Communist Party's absolute power. It selected an ambitious party secretary as the new leader, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. At 54, he was relatively young, a man from a rural background who had left his home in the south to study law in Moscow. He was a loyal communist and well acquainted with the workings of the party, yet he was idealistic too. He believed that measured reforms would create a stronger and more competitive Soviet Union. On March the 11th, 1985, as the nation mourned Chernenko's death, Gorbachev assumed the post of General Secretary.
Мы провожаем последний путь Константина Устиновича Черненко.
Конфликт самый
The main conflict,
важный, самый сложный,
and the most complicated one, it was greater than any of the other problems that we were worried about. This problem was the gap between the government and society. The people in power appeared to be concerned only with their own privileges. The government wanted to maintain the monopoly it had on everything, on ideology, leadership, decision-making, ultimately society, one of the best educated societies in the world, rich in the sciences, literature and culture, was reduced to discussing its ideas and opinions in the kitchen, so to speak. That was where freedom was. The kitchen was the place where people could discuss these issues.
Gorbachev filled his cabinet with like-minded reformers, but Gorbachev did not toe the party line. Instead, he unveiled bold reforms and pushed to implement them.
Well, I think Gorbachev had a vision rather than a plan. I don't think anybody, in fact, had a plan, so it's not really fair to blame him. But there was this general feeling that things had to change. In fact, he said that on the day he was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party, he told his wife Raisa, we cannot go on living like this. So everybody knew what they were against, but they weren't quite sure what they were for. And I think a lot of what Gorbachev did was improvisation.
Gorbachev's goals were daunting: revive the economy, regain the trust of the people, and restore the nation's image abroad. He did all he could to separate himself from his predecessors and show the world that this was a new USSR. On December the 7th, 1987, he signed an historic nuclear disarmament agreement with the United States. The West was now ready to believe that under Gorbachev, the Soviet Union was capable of keeping its word. Next, Gorbachev withdrew Soviet troops from Afghanistan. The country was now seen as capable of admitting and correcting its mistakes. At home, he introduced two strategies of reform. Perestroika was a bold restructuring of the nation's bureaucracy. It was a move away from a centralized economy towards a freer market. To battle corruption and restore public trust, Gorbachev introduced glasnost, a policy of openness and free speech. It was a radical break from years of suppression and censorship.
We had to give people the freedom to think, to express opinions, to take initiative in various fields, the arts, the economy, and so on.
What can I tell you? At the beginning, Gorbachev was supported by many. He was supported by the people of the country. The fact is that he came on the wave of society's discontent with the existing gerontocracy. That's why, at the first stage, he was enjoying great support.
The people of the Soviet Union embraced the new leader, but no one, not even Gorbachev himself, fully comprehended the forces he had set in motion.
I knew that once people started talking about freedom of the press, it would change everything. People would start to talk about the system, how inefficient the party was, how backward the country was, morals, ethics, and so on. And then certainly we would start to talk about Stalin's cult of the personality and all the atrocities that went with it. And that's exactly what happened, and rightly so.
The problem was that once the media was really allowed to dig into crimes, it didn't stop with recent crimes by individuals. It went back first to Stalin and then to Lenin. And of course, once they started undermining the memory of Lenin, there was really nothing left, because without Lenin, without the Bolsheviks, without the revolution, the Communist Party and the Soviet Union itself had no real basis.
Glasnost threatened the Communist Party's claim to authority. It was highly unpopular among the legions of Conservative Party bureaucrats who'd grown accustomed to undisputed power and privilege. Gorbachev walked a tightrope of compromise between two increasingly hostile factions. The conservative hardliners aligned on one side, on the other side were the progressives, who wanted faster and greater reforms. Glasnost had given these radical Democrats a voice. Perestroika was put to the test in the summer of 1988. Gorbachev called an unscheduled party conference.
The normal policy-making body of the Soviet Communist Party was a Congress, which took place every 5 years, and then in between you had the Central Committee meeting maybe twice a year. He decided that the Congress, which he'd held in '86, hadn't done the job, and he wanted something new. So delegates were stunned when he came up with the idea of forming a new kind of Soviet parliament. It would be called the Congress of People's Deputies, and the major change was that 2/3 of the seats would be freely elected. There'd be contested elections. Previous elections, of course, in the Soviet system were really artificial. And that was really the moment at which the revolution from above turned into the revolution from below. Suddenly, a license had been given for the Soviet public to really become politically engaged for the first time for 60 years.
The streets were filled with the unfamiliar buzz of political campaigning. In March 1989, the people chose representatives for the Congress of People's Deputies. It was their first taste of democracy. Russia and the other republics sent their most outspoken critics of the Soviet system into the national government.
They were truly free elections. Despite all of the shortcomings, it was a wave that swept away layers of waste that had been collecting for decades.
It did indeed produce a very strong vote for reform and change, but it also led to a tremendous mobilization of popular discontent. In various of the republics, this led to a wave of nationalism pointing towards independence from the Soviet Union. In Russia, it led to a great wave of support for the so-called Democrats, and particularly for a former communist boss turned populist politician, Boris Yeltsin.
In a sweep of the Moscow vote, Yeltsin secured a seat in the Congress of People's Deputies. Gorbachev's own reforms put Yeltsin back in power. The public was energized, but the economy continued to decline. Resistance to Gorbachev increased on both sides. Reforms cut the economy loose from centralized power, but without any new structure, industry and agriculture floundered. The Soviet people bore the brunt of the economic slide.
Let them film. What kind of glasses is there in this country?
I am a pensioner, he is a pensioner, and the children need meat.
Just tell us, will there be meat today?
There will be, but you have to wait.
I have 3 loaves of bread for my neighbor and me, and 5 small rolls.
How do you feel about the rise in prices?
At home, Gorbachev's popularity plummeted, but internationally he became something of a celebrity. The new foreign policy had made him the darling of the West. Polls in Europe revealed him to be more popular than any Western leader. The following year, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Inspired by this success, Gorbachev announced an end to Soviet intervention in Eastern Europe. The Warsaw Pact governments were now on their own. The declaration triggered a chain reaction. Democratic movements that had been smouldering in Eastern Europe sparked into life. By the end of the year, the communist Eastern Bloc was gone. Gorbachev tried to maintain an alliance, but it was clear that the Warsaw Pact was an obsolete relic of the Cold War. In the West, Gorbachev was a hero of democracy, but among conservative communists at home, he was the radical who lost Eastern Europe. They had cause to worry. The same nationalist forces that brought down the Iron Curtain were stirring in the very heart of the Soviet Union.
Comrade Mikhail Sergeyevich is elected president of the Supreme Soviet.
On March the 15th, 1990, Gorbachev was elected to the new office of the presidency. He entrusted this decision to the Congress of People's Deputies, but not to the Soviet public as a whole. Democrats began to push for a multi-party system. They pressurized Gorbachev to repeal Article 6, the law which guaranteed Communist Party rule. The new president yielded. For the first time, non-party members were free to hold government offices. Yeltsin wasted no time in resigning from the Communist Party. Suddenly, the most powerful man in Russia was a non-communist. Energized by the events in Eastern Europe, the other republics began to test the limits of perestroika. The Baltics had a history of bitter resentment towards Soviet rule. These tiny republics struck the first real blow to the Union.
Like other Soviet republics, the Baltic states had been part of the Russian Empire before the revolution. Unlike them, they gained their independence and were members of the League of Nations between 1920 and 1940. In 1940, they were annexed by Stalin as a result of a pact with Hitler the previous year, but they never forgot their legacy of independence.
On the 11th of March 1990, the new leaders of Lithuania proclaimed their independence from the USSR. Estonia and Latvia quickly followed suit. Gorbachev branded their actions illegal.
You will not secede from the Soviet Union. You are a civilized people, no matter what a few radicals might do, and you won't leave. You won't go against your conscience after all.
With the economy in freefall and the Baltics seceding, Gorbachev retreated to a more conservative stance. But the crisis only worsened. Soviet special forces seized the Free Lithuanian television station in Vilnius. Pro-independence demonstrators attempted a blockade. At least 13 people were killed. A week later in Riga, troops seized the Latvian Ministry of Internal Affairs, killing 4. To the south, crackdowns in Azerbaijan and Georgia had left many more dead. Vilnius and Riga, Baku and Tbilisi were now bloody spots on a reform process that was meant to be peaceful. In Russian cities, people voiced their outrage at the crackdowns. In a televised speech, Yeltsin called for Gorbachev's resignation and for the dissolution of the Soviet Congress of People's Deputies. Gorbachev decided to take the question to the Soviet people. In March 1991, the public voted on the fate of the USSR. Should the Union continue or be dissolved? The results were inconclusive. 6 republics abstained in protest, but those that participated voted overwhelmingly for the Union. Was weak. On the 12th of June 1991, Russians voted for their own president for the first time in history, and they chose Yeltsin. The president of the USSR and the president of Russia now worked side by side. The vote to maintain the Soviet Union changed nothing. Yeltsin and the Democrats continued to demand greater autonomy for the republics. Hardline conservatives in the Politburo called for a clampdown on the independence movement and an end to the reforms that were destroying the Union. As always, Gorbachev tried to strike a balance. He agreed to a deal that granted the republics limited sovereignty, but kept the Union intact. For the conservative hardliners, he had compromised the nation. The time for discussion was over. On the 19th of August, 8 top members of the Politburo called upon their control of the army and made their move. Their forces surprised Gorbachev at his holiday home in the Crimea. They surrounded his compound and held him there as prisoner. Then their tanks rolled into Moscow. They headed for the Russian parliament, the stronghold of the democratic movement. But the plotters underestimated the one man who had the power to stop them. Yeltsin seized his moment. While the world watched, he organized resistance around the parliament building. Thousands of demonstrators took to the streets to support him.
Соответственно, объявляем незаконными все решения и распоряжения этого комитета.
The Red Army was faced with a choice: either turn against the people of Moscow or turn against the military leaders.
If you're going to have a successful coup in the face of strong opposition, you need to involve the army as a whole. Now, in the Soviet Union, the coup plotters could not do that because they simply didn't trust most of the generals, let alone the soldiers. As a result, once it was clear that a sufficient number of ordinary people were turning against the coup, the army itself defected to the other side.
On the 21st of August, the plotters abandoned their bid for power. Gorbachev returned to work, still believing in communism, still believing in the future of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin had helped restore him to the presidency, but only for a time. The August coup had given Yeltsin the wedge he needed, and he drove it directly between Russia and the Soviet government.
Comrades, in order to allay tensions, I propose the signing of a decree that would suspend the activities of the Russian Communist Party.
The Communist Party, the very foundation of the Soviet Union, was effectively outlawed in Russia. Gorbachev had no choice but to resign from the party and disband the Central Committee. Still, he fought to maintain the Union. But the attempted coup had pushed the republics beyond his reach. One after another, they severed ties with the Soviet Union.
When the Soviet Union.
On the 8th of December 1991, in a forest near Minsk, Yeltsin signed a document creating the Commonwealth of Independent States. It was the death certificate of the USSR.
The ultimate.
Gorbachev was president of a country that no longer existed. On December the 25th, 1991, he formally resigned. The USSR was finished.
Yeltsin wanted to take